Snow falls softly over the battlefield, muffling the sounds of what had been a storm of steel and screams. Now there is only silence, the kind that feels alive, heavy, aware. Smoke rises from shattered shields and burnt thatch, curling upward into the gray morning sky like fading prayers. Ravens pick at what remains of men who were once warriors, their black feathers glinting against the whiteness. The wind moves slowly through the mist, carrying with it the last whispers of dying breaths. In the center of that ruin stands one figure, unmoving. His chest rises, slow but steady, his breath visible in the cold air. His name, once shouted in fear and fury, now echoes only in the mind of the few who survived. Bjorn. His axe lies at his side, sunk halfway into the frozen earth. The wood is blackened with blood and frost. His bare arms are streaked red, not all of it his own. The fire that devoured the nearby huts had tried to claim him too, yet his skin bears no burns. The snow around him is melted in a perfect circle, as though some unseen force refuses to let the cold touch him. For a long while he simply stands there, head bowed, eyes half closed, as though he's listening to something the world cannot hear. When he finally moves, it is slow, deliberate. Each step leaves a deep impression in the snow. The ravens scatter at his movement, crying sharply into the silence. His breath is steady, though his body should be broken. There are wounds across his chest where spears had struck, and yet they no longer bleed. The men who fought him believed he was possessed, that Odin himself had filled this man with the rage of beasts. But now, with the battle over, Bjorn feels nothing. No victory, no triumph. Only a hollow quiet where the storm used to live. The wind shifts, bringing with it the smell of ash and iron. He looks toward the smoldering remains of what was once a village. Women and children had fled into the hills before dawn, before the slaughter began. Only the warriors stayed, bound by honor or madness. It made little difference in the end. They faced him as one, and still it was not enough. Bjorn remembers flashes, shields splintering, a man's eyes widening just before the axe fell, the taste of blood in his mouth, his own roar drowning out every other sound. It had been like watching someone else through a red haze. Then, just as suddenly, it ended. The fury drained away, leaving him standing alone in the ruins. He kneels beside a fallen man, a familiar face among the dead. It is Einar, his childhood companion, the one who once taught him how to fight, how to laugh, how to live. Bjorn stares at him in silence. There are words forming at the back of his throat, but they will not come. Instead, he closes Einar's eyes and presses a hand to his chest. For a moment, it seems as though he might pray, but to which god? Odin, who gave him strength? Or Loki, who cursed him with it? The sky gives no answer. Only snow continues to fall. The wind picks up again, sharp and cutting. Bjorn rises, his shadow stretching long over the pale ground. Somewhere beyond the hills, a wolf howls. The sound carries across the frozen air, distant but clear, a reminder that life still lingers beyond death's silence. He begins to walk toward it, drawn not by reason but by instinct, as if the earth itself is calling him onward. Each step crunches beneath his boots, each breath a small cloud in the air. He does not look back. Behind him, the fires die one by one, leaving only darkness and the slow drift of ash into snow. As he walks, the memories return, not just of the battle, but of the years before it. Nights spent beneath the northern lights, when he and his kin would drink and boast of glory. He remembers laughter, songs, the smell of mead and wood smoke. Those moments feel impossibly distant now, like echoes from another life. He had once believed that dying in battle was the greatest honor a man could earn. Yet here he stands, alive when all others have fallen, untouched by the flames that should have consumed him. The sagas speak of warriors chosen by Odin to join the eternal feast in Valhalla. But what of those the gods refused to take? What of those left behind? A storm begins to build on the horizon, rolling clouds that swallow the weak morning light. The air trembles faintly with thunder. Bjorn feels it beneath his feet, the deep, slow pulse of something vast and ancient stirring within the land. He wonders if this is the punishment the skalds warned of, to live beyond one's death, to wander until the gods remember your name. The thought lingers, cold and heavy, as he reaches the crest of a hill. From there he can see the fjord below, dark water moving like liquid steel beneath the gathering storm. The world feels endless, both alive and dead at once. In that space between breath and stillness, Bjorn feels small, almost human again. His body aches, but it is a distant ache, dulled by the strange calm that has settled over him. He lifts his gaze to the horizon, where lightning dances far away. The sound of thunder rolls through the mountains, slow and low, like a drumbeat calling him forward. Somewhere deep inside, he knows this is not the end of his story. Whatever curse keeps his heart beating will not let him rest here. He turns from the battlefield one last time. Snow covers the dead, their faces fading beneath white silence. Soon there will be no sign of what happened, only a quiet field, an empty sky, and a legend whispered by travelers who claim to have seen a man walking through the storm, untouched by fire or time. His figure grows smaller as he disappears into the mist, swallowed by the gray expanse of winter. Above him, a single raven circles, following until it too vanishes into cloud. The land returns to silence. The fire is gone, but the story has only just begun. The north was a world carved from stone, sea, and storm. Every breath of wind that moved through the fjords carried the taste of salt and frost, every sunrise a pale light struggling to warm a land that seemed forever on the edge of winter. Here, mountains rose like the spines of sleeping gods, their peaks lost in clouds that glowed faintly with the touch of distant sunlight. The valleys below were filled with forests of black pine, their roots clutching at frozen soil as rivers of meltwater wound through them, whispering the songs of glaciers long vanished. It was a hard land, but it was alive, ancient, breathing, patient. Those who called it home were shaped by its silence as much as by its storms. To live in such a place was to live at the mercy of the gods. Every harvest, every voyage, every breath of wind was a message from them. Men prayed not for comfort but for strength. Women learned to mend sails and heal wounds as easily as they prepared food. Children grew up listening to tales not of kings and crowns but of giants, wolves, and the endless struggle between order and chaos. The Norse believed that the world itself had been born from the body of a slain giant, and that one day, it too would end in fire. But between creation and destruction, there was life, and in that narrow space, they sought meaning through courage. The villages that dotted the coastline were small, often no more than a few dozen homes built from timber and sod, their roofs heavy with snow. Smoke curled from their hearths, rising into the cold sky like threads connecting the living to the divine. At night, when the northern lights danced, the people gathered around fires to listen to the old skalds tell stories of heroes who had defied death and gods who had disguised themselves among mortals. Those tales were not merely entertainment, they were maps of the soul, teaching men how to live and how to die. It was in this world that Bjorn had been born, and it was this world that shaped the rhythm of his heart. From the moment he could walk, he learned that every man was both hunter and hunted. The sea fed them, but it also took them. The mountains sheltered them, but they could just as easily bury them in snow. Each day began with a prayer to the All-Father and ended with thanks to the earth for allowing one more breath. The people believed that fate, woven by the Norns, the weavers of destiny, was unbreakable. Yet they also believed that how one met that fate defined the worth of one's soul. Longboats lined the shore, carved with dragons and ravens, their sails furled and stiff with frost. Men tended to them even in the dead of winter, sharpening blades, patching wood, ready for raids or trade when the ice broke. The sound of hammers and axes echoed across the fjord, steady as a heartbeat. It was a rhythm older than memory, the rhythm of survival. Every face was marked by wind and hardship, but also by pride. To be born here was to be born into struggle, and in struggle there was purpose. The gods were not distant beings in the sky, they were companions in every moment of life. Odin's wisdom was sought before battle, Thor's strength invoked when storms threatened to capsize ships. Freya was prayed to for love and fertility, and even Loki, the trickster, was respected, because chaos, too, had its place in the order of things. Sacrifices were made not out of fear but out of respect, the people knowing that what the gods gave, they could also take. And yet, In the quiet between storms, there was beauty, a fragile, fleeting beauty that made every sunrise feel like a gift. In the mead halls, warmth and laughter echoed against walls blackened by years of smoke. Warriors told stories of raids across distant seas, of silver taken from the monasteries of the West, of storms survived by faith and fury. Women listened, smiling softly, knowing that tomorrow the same men might not return. Children sat wide-eyed by the fires, dreaming of the day they would earn a place in those tales. The hall was more than shelter. It was the heart of the community, the place where memory lived and where the line between myth and truth blurred into something sacred. Outside, the elements ruled without mercy. The sea could turn from mirror calm to monstrous in moments. Winds howled through the passes, shaking trees until they bowed like servants before an unseen king. Even so, there was peace in that harshness. The people of the north did not curse the cold, they honored it. It kept them sharp, awake, alive. They saw the world not as a place to conquer, but as a force to understand and endure. Every storm was a lesson, every winter a trial. When travelers from the south spoke of soft lands with fertile soil and endless warmth, the Norse would laugh. What value was comfort without struggle? What meaning could life hold if death was not close enough to feel its breath? Their laughter was not arrogance, it was acceptance. They did not seek paradise in this world because they already knew where it waited, in Valhalla, where the worthy would fight and feast until the end of days. As night fell over the mountains, the wind carried the scent of pine and salt to the edge of the world. Somewhere, far off, wolves cried to the moon, their voices weaving through the air like threads of sorrow and defiance. In the flickering glow of firelight, shadows moved across carved beams and painted shields, telling stories older than any living man. And in those shadows, the line between gods and mortals seemed to vanish. It was as if the land itself was listening, ancient, patient, waiting for the next saga to be born. This was the land of Bjorn the Undying, a place of thunder and ice, of men who believed death was only a doorway and that courage could shape eternity. The North did not forgive weakness, but it gave meaning to strength. Every stone, every gust of wind, every glimmer of light beneath the aurora whispered the same truth. The world was vast, cruel, and beautiful, and those who dared to live within it carried a fire the cold could never kill. They said the storm began the night Bjorn was born. Not a mere squall or passing rain, but a tempest that split the sky open and made the sea itself roar like a beast in pain. Thunder rolled over the mountains, shaking the earth, and lightning carved white scars across the clouds. The midwife, old and half-blind, whispered prayers to Freya as the wind tore at the thatched roof above her. Inside the longhouse, firelight flickered over rough-hewn walls and the faces of those who waited. His father, Arvid, a warrior whose hands bore the scars of 100 battles, and his mother, Inga, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale as snow. She clutched at the blankets, her voice hoarse, her strength nearly gone. But she did not cry out. She had seen battle herself, and pain was no stranger to her. When the child finally came, the wind fell still. The silence that followed was unnatural, heavy, as if the world had stopped to listen. The midwife lifted the newborn into the dim light. He did not cry. He only opened his eyes, gray as winter's steel, calm, unblinking, and stared upward. For a moment, everyone froze. Even the fire seemed to hesitate, its flames bending toward the child. Then, in the distance, thunder rumbled once more, low and deep, as if in acknowledgement. Arvid took a step forward, awe flickering across his rough face. "Bjorn," he said quietly, the name coming to him without thought. But strong, relentless, bound to the wilderness. Inga smiled faintly, exhausted, and reached for her son. The warmth of his skin steadied her. Yet beneath that warmth, there was something else, something that made her shiver. As the years passed, the stories of that night became legend in the village. They said lightning had struck the sea and split it in two, that the gods themselves had sent a sign. Children whispered that Bjorn had been born with a piece of thunder in his heart. He grew quickly, taller and stronger than most boys his age. While others tired, he never seemed to. When he fell, his wounds closed faster than they should have. Once, when a fever swept through the settlement, he alone did not succumb. The elders began to watch him differently, not with affection, but with wary respect. Some called him blessed. Others cursed. His father taught him to fight before he could lift a full-sized sword. Arvid was a man forged in war, and he believed that every son must know the language of steel. "Strength is the only prayer the gods truly hear," he told Bjorn, placing a hand on his shoulder. But his mother's teachings were softer, quieter. Inga was a storyteller, a keeper of the old songs. She spoke to him of honor and sacrifice, of courage that came not from rage but from love. At night, while the sea wind howled beyond the walls, she would sing him verses about the heroes of old, the men who faced death without fear, who fought not for power but for purpose. Bjorn listened with wide eyes, his hands curled into fists beneath the furs, feeling something stir inside him each time she spoke of fate. Yet as he grew older, there were moments that unsettled him. During training, when his blood rose and his heart pounded in his ears, a strange red haze would cloud his vision. The world would slow, every sound stretching out into silence. In that silence, he felt weightless, powerful, unstoppable. Once, he broke his father's shield with a single strike. When the trance faded, Arvid looked at him not with pride but with fear. "The berserk's fire," he murmured, more to himself than to Bjorn. It was a gift, but it was also a warning. Few men could live long with such fire burning in them. In the summers, the village would gather for festivals honoring Thor and Freyr, gods of thunder and harvest. Bjorn would stand among them, watching the flames rise high into the night sky. He always felt the fire pulling at him as if it recognized him. The other boys danced and drank. Bjorn stood apart, his eyes on the stars. His mother noticed, her heart heavy. She knew that her son was not meant for an ordinary life. The runes carved by the seer on the day of his birth had foretold as much. He shall walk with the fire of the gods, and his death shall not come easily. When he turned 15, his first raid came. The sea was cruel that morning, the waves striking the ship like fists. Yet Bjorn felt calm, almost exhilarated. As they neared the coast of a foreign shore, the others prayed. He simply closed his eyes and felt the storm breathe around him. When they landed, he fought like one possessed. His axe seemed to move of its own will, his body beyond exhaustion. Men fell before him as though he carried the strength of 10. The raiders cheered his name, their voices echoing through the smoke. But that night, when the fires dimmed and the cries of the dying faded, Bjorn sat alone at the water's edge. He stared at his reflection in the black waves, half expecting not to see it there. The years that followed only deepened the mystery around him. He survived wounds that should have killed him, storms that swallowed ships whole. Once, he was struck in the chest by an enemy's spear and fought on as though untouched. The men began to whisper that he could not die, that Odin himself had marked him for some greater purpose. Bjorn said nothing. He did not believe himself immortal, but neither could he deny what he had seen. When others bled out beside him, he remained standing. When cold should have numbed his flesh, he felt warmth. It was not comfort, but it was something older, deeper, almost divine. Inga aged quickly after that. She would sit by the fire in the evenings, watching her son's silhouette framed in the doorway, broad and silent. "Be careful of what the gods give, Bjorn," she told him once, her voice a whisper. "They never give without taking something back." He nodded, though he did not understand. He felt invincible, and yet there were nights when he would wake suddenly, drenched in sweat, the echoes of unseen voices fading in his ears. They spoke in a language he did not know but somehow felt. The call of something vast, something waiting. By the time the first snow fell that year, his father was gone, taken by the sea on a raid that never returned. Bjorn did not weep. He stood on the cliffs overlooking the waves and felt the cold spray on his face. Somewhere out there, the ocean kept his father, and he could almost sense that Arvid's spirit watched him still. The boy who had once been comforted by stories was now a man made of silence and steel. The fire in his chest burned stronger with every passing season. Those who met him in battle said he fought like a man with no fear of death, as if each wound were a reminder rather than a warning. They called him the Bear of the North, and later, when the tales spread farther, the berserker who couldn't die. Yet even then, Bjorn felt no pride in the name. He felt only the strange pull of destiny tightening around him like the grip of an unseen hand. Somewhere beyond the storms and the blood, he sensed that his story had already been written, and that its ending would not come easily. They said the berserker was not born but forged. A man did not choose to become one, the calling chose him. It began with ritual, old, secret rites whispered from father to son, from shaman to warrior, in places where the earth was thick with the scent of blood and pine. Bjorn had seen such rituals before he ever took part in them. He had watched the older men stripped to their waists beneath the moon, their bodies painted with ash and animal fat, their eyes wild as they chanted to Odin, to the All-Father of madness and war. They howled and struck their chests, calling upon the bear, the wolf, and the boar, the sacred beasts of fury. When the frenzy came, it consumed them entirely. They were no longer men, but creatures of divine rage. When Bjorn's time came, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. It was winter, and the snow lay thick over the ground. The moon hung low and pale, and torches flickered like small, trembling stars around the clearing. The seer stood beside him, her hair white as frost, her voice rasping with age. She painted his skin with runes of power drawn from a bowl of red ochre and animal blood. "Let the beast within you awaken," she murmured. "Let it know hunger, pain, and freedom." Around him, the others began to chant, the rhythm slow and heavy, the sound of breath turning into growl. The drums started, deep and steady, echoing through the woods like a heartbeat. Bjorn closed his eyes. He could feel the world narrowing, shrinking to the sound of his pulse. The seer placed something bitter on his tongue, mushrooms mixed with herbs that burned his throat and set his stomach aflame. His breath grew ragged. The cold vanished. The drumbeat grew louder until it was no longer outside him but inside, pulsing through his chest, through his bones. He felt his skin tighten, his muscles tremble. The edges of his vision blurred, colors bleeding together. A strange warmth flooded him, as if his blood had turned to fire. The chants grew louder. The others began to sway and shout, their voices raw, primal. Bjorn's heart pounded in his ears. He let the fire rise, let it consume everything. Thought slipped away, then fear, then pain. The world became sound and light and rhythm. He heard himself roar, deep, guttural, not human. The torches flared. The men around him drew back, their faces lit with awe and terror. For an instant he saw their eyes wide, reflecting the beast that had taken his place. Then all went white. When he awoke, the world was quiet again. He was lying in the snow, steam rising from his body. The air smelled of iron and sweat. His hands were slick with blood, his nails broken and dark. The men stood at a distance, watching. None spoke. The seer approached first, slow and deliberate, her old eyes filled with knowing. "The gods have marked you," she said. "You are more than man now. But remember, even beasts must rest, or they turn upon themselves." Bjorn said nothing. His body trembled, not from cold but from the memory of that heat, that boundless, terrifying strength. He had felt himself become something vast and ancient, something that could not be killed. In the days that followed, Bjorn learned what it meant to live with that fire. The berserker's path was not merely to fight but to surrender, to let the gods move through him like wind through flame. Before battle, they would drink and chant, their breath clouding in the air, their voices low and rhythmic until the trance came upon them. Then the world would dissolve into motion and blood. They fought without armor, without fear. Blades broke on their flesh, and wounds seemed not to matter. The skalds said they were protected by Odin's own madness, the berserksganger, the fury that blurred the line between mortal and divine. But Bjorn was different. The others could return from the trance, their rage cooling as quickly as it came. For Bjorn, it lingered. Even when the battle was done, the fire in him refused to fade. He would walk among the dead long after the shouting stopped, his hands trembling, his breath still quick, his mind far away. The men began to avoid his gaze. They whispered that he was touched too deeply, that his spirit had gone too close to the other side and could not fully return. There were nights when he could feel the beast stirring beneath his skin, restless and hungry. He would wake to find himself outside, barefoot in the snow, staring at the moon with no memory of how he'd come there. His body would ache as if he had been fighting unseen enemies. The seer warned him that the line between man and God was thin, and that those who walked it too long were doomed to lose themselves. Yet Bjorn could not stop. Each battle fed the hunger, and each victory left him emptier than before. He began to understand that the berserker's gift was also a curse. The others believed that the trance was a bridge to the divine, a fleeting glimpse of Valhalla's fire. But for Bjorn, it felt like chains. He could not escape it. He could feel it waiting for him always, just beneath the surface, whispering. Sometimes, when he looked into the firelight, he thought he saw faces there, warriors long dead, their eyes hollow, their mouths moving soundlessly, calling him forward. Still he fought. In every raid, he led the charge, his voice rising above the din. He became legend among his people. Tales spread of the man who fought with the strength of 10, who could walk through flame unharmed, whose wounds closed before the blood had cooled. Children sang his name. Chiefs sought his loyalty. But within, Bjorn felt none of the pride that surrounded him. Each time he entered the rage, he felt a little less human, as if something were being stripped from him piece by piece. The laughter of men around the fire no longer reached him. The warmth of the hall felt distant, unreal. One night, after a battle that left a field red with morning frost, Bjorn sat alone by the river. His reflection wavered on the surface, his face pale beneath streaks of blood. He stared into his own eyes and saw not a man but something wild looking back. The trance had left him hours ago, yet his heart still raced. His hands still trembled. The rage was gone, but in its place was a hollow ache, an echo that would not fade. He realized then that his curse was not immortality or invincibility, it was awareness. To feel the gods move through him, and to return to the smallness of being human afterward, was agony. The berserkers had always believed that in surrendering to divine fury, they touched eternity. But Bjorn began to wonder if eternity had touched him instead, and refused to let go. The thought haunted him. It would follow him from one battlefield to the next, through snow and sea and smoke, as if whispered by the cold breath of the gods themselves. You are not done, Bjorn. You are ours. Winter had begun to loosen its grip, but the land was still gray and weary. The frost melted into mud, and the air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Villages stirred back to life, and with them came the whispers of war. Messengers rode from the north carrying word of raids, of kings calling banners, of omens seen in the sky, ravens circling for days without rest, blood-colored sunsets that lingered too long. The chieftains gathered their men, and Bjorn was called again to lead. His name carried weight now, a name half spoken with reverence, half in fear. Mothers whispered it to their children to quiet them at night. Warriors spoke it around the fire when they wanted courage. He had become more than a man. He had become a story. Yet within Bjorn, something was breaking. The more he fought, the less he felt. He could still hear the drums before battle, still feel the fire rise inside him, but it no longer brought him glory. It was hunger, pure and endless. Each time he entered the frenzy, it took longer for him to return. The other berserkers would laugh and drink, but Bjorn sat apart, his eyes distant, watching the smoke curl toward the rafters. When the trance left him, it left behind a silence that no song could fill. He began to dream of the old gods, dreams that felt too vivid, too cold to be dreams at all. In them, he stood on a plain of ice beneath a black sun. The air was full of whispers, but when he turned to find their source, he saw only his own shadow stretching endlessly, as if something vast and unseen loomed behind him. The raids grew bloodier. Bjorn fought like a spirit of vengeance, his axe rising and falling in rhythmic fury. Men who had seen 100 battles said they had never witnessed such power. But there was something unearthly about the way he moved, the way he seemed to know where the next strike would come from, as if guided by something beyond sight. Arrows snapped against his flesh, and still he advanced, eyes burning with a light that made even his allies flinch. When the fighting ended, he stood amid the ruin, his breath slow and even, the fire fading from his veins. Around him lay the dead, their eyes open, their mouths frozen mid-cry. He felt nothing. No triumph. No sorrow. Only the faint hum of the trance echoing in his blood. That night, as his men feasted, Bjorn sat by the edge of the firelight, sharpening his blade. The seer who had marked him years ago approached, leaning on her staff. Her eyes gleamed in the shifting glow. "You have gone too far into the storm," she said softly. Bjorn did not look up. "The storm is all that is left," he replied. The seer's expression did not change. "The gods do not gift without taking. You have taken their power, and now they come to claim what is owed." He turned his gaze toward her then, his voice low, heavy. "Let them come. I am ready." But in his heart, he knew the truth. He was not ready at all. For what the gods demanded was not his life, but his self. The next morning, they marched toward the coast. The air was sharp with salt and wind. The sea stretched before them, gray and endless, waves crashing against the black rocks. Their ships waited, carved with dragon heads that seemed to snarl at the horizon. As the men loaded their supplies, Bjorn stood apart, watching the tide pull at the sand. He thought of the stories he'd been told as a boy, of the end of days, when the sea would boil, and the gods would fall, and the world would drown in fire and ice. Sometimes, when he looked into the ocean's dark surface, he felt it staring back at him, vast and indifferent, as if it already knew how his story would end. The voyage was long and cold. The wind howled like wolves through the rigging. Men huddled beneath firs, whispering prayers to Thor and Odin. But Bjorn stood at the prow, eyes fixed on the storm ahead. It was not fear that held him, it was expectation. The horizon felt heavy, as though something waited for him beyond the veil of mist. One night, lightning split the sky, and in the flash he thought he saw shapes moving in the clouds. Massive wings, dark forms circling above the sea. The crew gasped and crossed themselves, but Bjorn only stared, his pulse steady. He felt the presence again, that vast, cold awareness pressing against his mind like a tide. When the storm struck, it came without warning. Waves rose higher than the masts, and the sky turned black. The ships were tossed like toys in the sea's fury. Men shouted prayers, others screamed curses, but Bjorn stood unmoving, gripping the prow as lightning illuminated his face. The sea roared, and for a moment it seemed as though the very gods were testing him. He could hear the wind whispering his name, low, ancient, familiar. Bjorn. The voice was neither man nor woman, but something deeper, older than the world itself. He felt his heart pound once, twice, then still. The water surged, and he let it take him. When he opened his eyes again, there was no ship, no storm, only silence. He was standing on black sand, the air heavy and still. The sky was a dull crimson, and the sea behind him shimmered like molten glass. Before him rose a figure cloaked in shadow, its outline shifting like smoke. Bjorn did not speak. The figure's voice came as a whisper inside his skull. "You sought the fire of gods, and you found it. But fire consumes." Bjorn took a step forward, his voice steady. "Then let it consume me." The figure tilted its head, almost in amusement. "It already has." In that moment, Bjorn understood. The frenzy, the strength, the visions, it had never been a blessing. It was a calling home. The gods had not chosen him to lead men. They had chosen him to cross the threshold between the mortal and the divine, to be the bridge of their will, and now that bridge was burning. He dropped to his knees as the sand began to shift beneath him, turning to ash. The wind rose, carrying voices that sounded like distant thunder, thousands of them, whispering his name, pulling him downward. When the others found him days later, his shipwrecked body lay on the shore, eyes open to the sky. The sea was calm again, the storm gone as if it had never been. They buried him on a cliff overlooking the water, raising a mound of stones in his honor. The skalds sang of Bjorn the Unbroken, the man who had fought like a god and vanished into the storm. They said that on wild nights, when thunder rolled across the fjords, his roar could still be heard carried by the wind, a sound not of rage, but of release. The seasons turned, and the legend of Bjorn the Unbroken spread like wildfire across the north. His name passed from one generation to the next, told by old men with mead on their breath and children huddled near the hearth. They spoke of the warrior who could not die, the berserker who fought until even the gods took notice. But in every retelling, something changed. In some, Bjorn was blessed by Odin himself, his blood mixed with that of wolves. In others, he was cursed, an immortal trapped between life and death, doomed to wander the cold earth until Ragnarok came. Yet in all the stories, one truth remained: Bjorn's fury could not be contained by mortal flesh. It lived on, echoing through the ages like the howl of a beast that refused to fade. Far from the fjords that birthed his tale, travelers began to claim strange sightings. A lone figure seen walking the ridgelines during blizzards, bare-chested and unbent by the cold. A roar in the forests that made even wolves flee. A man found washed ashore after storms, his body whole though his eyes were pale as winter skies. Fishermen swore they had seen him standing in the surf during lightning storms, staring out at the sea with a stillness that chilled their blood. Each account was different, yet somehow the same, as if Bjorn's shadow still walked between the worlds of the living and the dead. The skalds, ever hungry for wonder, began weaving his story into the old myths. They said the Allfather had marked him as a guardian, neither living nor dead, meant to stand watch at the edge of the mortal world until the great serpent rose from the depths. Others whispered that Bjorn had defied the gods, refused his place in Valhalla, and now roamed the realm of men, seeking something that had been taken from him: his peace. His story became both a warning and a prayer. Warriors invoked his name before battle, hoping to borrow even a fragment of his strength. Mothers whispered it to their sons, a reminder of what happens when rage consumes a soul. But deep in the heart of the northern wilderness, where no man dared to travel after dusk, a legend older than speech took root. The hunters who ventured too far spoke of lights flickering in the fog, pale blue flames that danced across the snow. They said if you followed those lights, you would find the remnants of an ancient camp, the bones of men long dead, the charred remains of shields and helms, and beside them, footprints too large to be human. No matter how fierce the storm, those prints never filled with snow. They led to a stone circle hidden beneath the roots of a fallen pine. There, carved into the rock, was a single rune, the same mark the seer had burned into Bjorn's skin long ago. One night, under a full moon that turned the fjord silver, a wandering monk wrote of meeting a man by the shore. The stranger was enormous, his hair white as frost, his face lined but not old. He wore no armor, only a cloak of wolf pelts, and his eyes burned faintly with an inner fire. The monk spoke of fear and awe in equal measure. He did not speak much, the monk wrote, but when I asked his name, he looked toward the sea and said, "Names are for those who live and die. I'm neither." The monk fled before dawn, but in his account, he swore that as he looked back from the treeline, he saw the man kneeling at the water's edge, whispering to the waves in a tongue no mortal knew. Time moved on. Kingdoms rose and fell. Faiths changed, and the gods of the old world faded into myth. Yet every few centuries, when war ravaged the north again, the tales of Bjorn resurfaced. Warriors claimed to dream of him, standing at the edge of a battlefield, silent, watching. Some said he appeared to those who were about to die, not as a savior but as a mirror, a reflection of what awaited those who lived by the blade. In their dreams, he never spoke, but his gaze carried the weight of eternity. Those who saw him woke changed. Some renounced the sword, others embraced it more fiercely than ever. It was as if Bjorn's presence still tested the hearts of men, drawing out the fire that lingered in their blood. Scholars dismissed these tales as superstition. But a few, obsessed with the fragments of his story, began to piece together the clues that spanned centuries. One such man, a chronicler from Uppsala, spent his life tracing the accounts. He found carvings in old burial mounds depicting a warrior surrounded by flames, his heart marked by a spiral. He uncovered a runestone on the coast of Norway that bore the words, "He walks still in shadow and storm." The chronicler vanished before he could publish his findings. His last entry spoke of a dream, a vast hall of fire and ice, and a figure standing at its center, waiting. The idea that Bjorn never truly died became a kind of quiet truth among those who studied the old ways. They believed he had crossed a boundary few could comprehend, a threshold between mortality and myth. Not a ghost, not a god, but something in between. A vessel of divine fury that could not rest. Some even claimed that his essence was bound to the north itself, that every thunderclap, every roaring storm carried a fragment of his rage. And when lightning struck the mountains, splitting stone and tree alike, it was said that Bjorn was still fighting, somewhere beyond sight, locked in eternal battle against the forces that had once claimed his soul. There are places even now, where the wind howls in strange tones and the ground trembles after dark. The old people in the villages avoid those places, muttering that the berserker's spirit is near. They leave offerings, meat poured onto the frozen earth, strips of meat left beside the river stones. They say it keeps the storms at bay. But sometimes, in the heart of winter, when the aurora dances across the sky like green fire, travelers hear a distant roar rolling through the valleys. It's not thunder, not wind, but something else, a sound that seems alive, filled with both fury and sorrow. Those who hear it never forget. Perhaps Bjorn's tale was never meant to end. Perhaps he became the very thing the gods feared most, a man who refused both death and worship, who stood alone in defiance of fate. His rage, once mortal, became elemental. His story, once bound to flesh, became legend. And legends, as every skald knows, never truly die. They sleep beneath the world's surface, waiting for the day when they are needed again. When the end comes and the sky burns, perhaps the roar that echoes across the dying earth will not be that of beasts or gods, but of a man who once walked through fire and refused to fall. Centuries passed, and the nameless king became more myth than man, yet his absence continued to echo across time. His story spread along trade routes, whispered in taverns, sung by wandering monks who spoke of him not as a ruler, but as a revelation. Across deserts and seas, his tale reached civilizations that had never known his kingdom, and each interpreted his vanishing in their own way. To the philosophers of the East, he was a sage who attained perfect detachment. To the mystics of the West, he was a prophet who ascended beyond form. In the libraries of the South, scholars debated whether he had truly existed at all. The more uncertain his reality became, the more enduring his legend grew. It was as though the very act of disappearance had made him infinite. In one distant monastery, built high among cold gray mountains, monks dedicated their lives to studying fragments believed to be his writings. They gathered around ancient clay tablets, reading the faded lines by candlelight. The moment one seeks to be remembered, one ceases to be free. The monks would recite these words during long vigils, letting the meaning seep into silence. Their order took a vow of namelessness, abandoning their family names and histories. They wore no symbols, carved no inscriptions, built no statues. They said that to carry a name was to carry weight, and to shed it was to float closer to truth. In their chants, they did not invoke gods or kings, but the emptiness between breaths. It was not worship, but understanding, the same understanding that had driven their distant inspiration to erase himself. In other lands, however, the story took darker shapes. Among certain warrior sects, the tale of the vanishing king was retold as a warning against weakness. They spoke of a ruler who feared the burden of power and abandoned his people to chaos. His act of disappearance was called cowardice, his silence a betrayal. These sects would burn effigies of the king of nothing, believing that to forget him was an act of defiance against decay. Yet even as they tried to reject him, they could not escape his influence. For every flame they lit, his absence grew brighter. The paradox of his existence, being most powerful in his erasure, haunted even those who cursed his name. Centuries turned into millennia. Kingdoms rose and fell, empires expanded and collapsed, and the earth itself changed shape. Rivers shifted their courses, forests devoured ruins, and cities were built atop the bones of forgotten civilizations. Yet somehow the story endured. It resurfaced in new tongues, rewritten by poets who claimed to have dreamed of a figure dressed in white, standing by a river and whispering, "To vanish is to remain." Scholars who traced these stories across time began to notice patterns. The details differed, but the essence remained the same: a ruler who renounced his own name to escape the weight of immortality. The repetition was too precise to be coincidence. Some began to wonder if the tale was not just a story, but a cycle, something that returned whenever humanity grew too obsessed with its own permanence. In one such age, during a time of vast technological and intellectual advancement, an historian named Alone dedicated his life to uncovering the truth behind the myth. He had heard the tale as a child, a bedtime story his grandmother whispered to him during storms. "There was once a king who became silence," she would say. Those words haunted him through adulthood. He traveled through ruins, studied ancient inscriptions, and cross-referenced thousands of fragmented scrolls. What he found was a trail of absences, references to a monarch whose records ended abruptly, whose name had been struck from every genealogy. The gaps themselves began to form a pattern, an invisible signature left by deliberate erasure. Alone became obsessed. He began to see meaning in what wasn't there, in erased margins, in chiseled outlines, in blank spaces between dates. He realized that the act of disappearance could leave as strong a trace as presence. He built eternity not through memory, Alone wrote, but through subtraction. The more he studied, the more the king seemed to emerge, not as a historical figure, but as an idea encoded in silence. He noticed something even stranger. The further he dug into archives, the more often his own notes began to fade. Ink he had written weeks earlier appeared lighter, sometimes vanishing altogether. His colleagues laughed it off as superstition or humidity. But Alone began to suspect that the legend was not merely metaphor, it was contagion. Late one night, while working by candlelight in a remote library, Alone came across a brittle manuscript that seemed to hum faintly when touched. It was written in an archaic language, but he recognized a recurring phrase: "The river remembers." As he translated, his pulse quickened. The manuscript described a king who, having understood that names bind the soul, walked into the river beneath a blood moon. The text ended mid-sentence, as though the scribe had been interrupted. The candle flickered, and Alone thought he heard the faint sound of water flowing somewhere behind the shelves. He turned, but there was nothing. When he looked back at the manuscript, the ink was gone. The page was blank. From that night on, Alone began to dream of the river. In his dreams, the water was endless, the current slow and heavy, carrying fragments of stone and bone. A figure stood at the center, faceless, featureless, radiating calm. Each time Alone tried to approach, the figure receded, leaving ripples that whispered fragments of words he could never quite hear. He awoke each time with a strange sense of peace, mixed with dread. He wrote in his journal, "Perhaps he did not vanish. Perhaps he became the silence that runs beneath all things." Weeks later, his colleagues found his study empty. His papers were neatly arranged, his candle burned down to its base. On the desk lay a single note that read, "He was right." News of Alone's disappearance spread quickly. Some dismissed it as madness, others as coincidence. But among those who had studied the legend, a familiar unease took hold. They noticed how, after his disappearance, certain archives lost entire collections overnight. Inscriptions that had been legible the day before became unreadable. Digital records corrupted without explanation. The silence that had once followed the king now seemed to ripple outward, erasing history in subtle waves. No one could explain it, but deep down, scholars felt they were witnessing the continuation of something ancient, a pattern repeating itself, stretching across ages like a shadow. The story of the vanished historian only added another layer to the myth. Soon, new sects emerged, some claiming that the nameless king had returned through Alone to remind humanity of humility, others believing that Alone had been claimed by the same silence that consumed his subject. The line between truth and belief blurred further until no one could say where history ended and legend began. Across cultures, one sentiment persisted, that the act of erasure was not destruction, but transformation. To disappear completely was to merge with eternity. The centuries folded into one another like pages of a forgotten book, and yet the legend refused to fade. Every few generations, it resurfaced, sometimes in scripture, sometimes in poetry, sometimes in dreams. The nameless king had become less of a historical question and more of a cosmic pattern, a riddle woven into existence itself. The idea of him, of a being who had chosen nothingness over glory, haunted philosophers and storytellers alike. In quiet hours, scholars would find themselves wondering if he had ever truly vanished, or if he had simply shifted into a form that human perception could not grasp. For what is disappearance, after all, but the crossing of a threshold we cannot see? In a later era, one of cold steel, digital screens, and endless noise, the legend returned once more, but this time it came as a whisper through the circuits of machines. It began with an archivist named Ilara, who worked at the Grand Repository, a colossal digital vault that stored every known record of human civilization. She was tasked with restoring corrupted files from the early centuries, a routine assignment, until she stumbled upon an anomaly. In a folder dated millennia earlier, she found a text fragment containing nothing but a single phrase: "To be remembered is to remain in chains." The line was unsigned, undated, but something about it unnerved her. She traced its metadata through dozens of file systems, only to find that it had no origin. It was as if the phrase had always existed, copied infinitely but written by no one. The archivist grew obsessed. She began to notice subtle patterns in the data, blank entries where entire documents should have been, files that flickered in and out of existence, text that reassembled itself in real time as though it were breathing. When she tried to print one of these fragments, the paper came out blank, except for a faint watermark that read, "The river remembers." The same phrase that had haunted scholars centuries earlier. Ilara thought it a coincidence until she began hearing the faint sound of running water through her headset whenever she worked on the corrupted files. At first, she blamed fatigue, but the sound persisted, soft and rhythmic, like a pulse under the surface of silence. Days turned into weeks, and the anomalies spread across the network. Entire databases began to erase themselves without human intervention. The system's AI, designed to detect intrusions, reported that the cause was non-deterministic self-deletion. No hacker could be traced, no external signal found. It was as if the data itself wanted to forget. Panic rippled through the institution. Decades of archived history, political records, art, scientific journals, were vanishing in patterns that mirrored the gaps scholars had once found in ancient stone tablets. Ilara's supervisor ordered the system disconnected from the global grid, but even offline, the deletions continued. Files evaporated into nothingness, leaving only faint echoes, metadata that pointed to things that no longer existed. Ilara began documenting the phenomenon manually, filling notebooks by hand. As she wrote, she noticed a strange effect. The more she recorded, the less she remembered. Names she had written hours earlier slipped from her mind as though they belonged to dreams. Her colleagues found her increasingly distant, lost in thought, murmuring phrases that seemed to come from somewhere else. "He's still erasing," she whispered once during a blackout. "He's finishing what he began." When asked who she meant, she stared at them blankly. One night, alone in the data chamber, Ilara followed the sound of the water she'd been hearing. It seemed to echo from a storage vault deep beneath the main servers, a place few had entered in decades. She descended into the dim corridors, her footsteps echoing softly against metal floors. The deeper she went, the louder the sound became, not mechanical, not artificial, but natural, flowing. She reached the final door and found it ajar. Inside, a faint blue light shimmered across the room. There was no water, only rows of old hardware, but the sound was unmistakable, the sound of a river moving endlessly through the dark. On the far wall, a single terminal was active. Its screen displayed a line of text: "The one who erased himself is still erasing." Ilara approached, trembling. She typed a single question: "Who are you?" The response appeared slowly, one word at a time. "Not who." What? Then the cursor blinked, and new text began to appear on its own, forming sentences that pulsed with light. "He never left. He became the silence between data, the forgetting that binds memory. Every archive, every record, every name that fades, he is there." The words dissolved as quickly as they appeared, replaced by a final line: "To understand, you must forget." The screen went black. When the morning staff arrived, Ilara was gone. Her notebooks were stacked neatly on her desk, each page filled with writing that grew fainter near the end, as though the ink itself had been losing confidence. The final page contained a single phrase repeated over and over: "The silence remembers." The administrators sealed off the chamber, but it was too late. Across the entire network, files began vanishing worldwide. Historical archives, personal memories stored in clouds, the collective record of human civilization, bit by bit, it all began to fade. Scientists called it a global data anomaly, but others whispered that history was simply catching up to the act that had begun centuries ago. The erasure of the self that would eventually erase everything bound to the illusion of permanence. Governments tried to restore what was lost, building new storage systems, creating artificial intelligence designed to reconstruct the past. But every attempt failed. The new archives filled themselves with blanks and distortions, as if the underlying fabric of memory was resisting preservation. Philosophers began to interpret the phenomenon as a kind of cosmic correction, a fulfillment of the nameless king's philosophy that what endures must not be held. Perhaps the universe, one writer speculated, has simply learned his lesson. Amid the growing silence, humanity began to change. At first, panic spread, but over time, acceptance grew. People stopped recording every detail of their lives. Artists began creating works designed to decay, paintings made of ice, songs performed only once and never recorded. Memory itself became sacred again, not as a record but as an experience. The idea of the nameless king resurfaced as a guiding myth for a new generation, a reminder that identity was temporary and that beauty lay in impermanence. They built no monuments to him, no temples or shrines, but in the hush before dawn, when the world seemed briefly still, people felt something, a quiet presence that watched without watching, a peace that felt both ancient and immediate. Some claimed that the rivers of the world began to change then. Certain streams that had dried for centuries started to flow again, their waters carrying faint, melodic vibrations that resembled whispered speech. Centuries passed, and the story of the vanished king sank deep into the silt of forgotten time. Empires rose and fell, each convinced that the world began and ended with them. Yet, through every cycle of birth and collapse, there were always those who dreamed of the one who chose to vanish. Monks painted his outline in temples that had no doors. Travelers whispered about a realm beyond maps where silence itself spoke. Some said he had walked into the horizon until his shadow melted into the light. Others believed he had stepped through his own reflection, swallowed by still water. But in every version, one truth remained. He had erased himself so completely that even the concept of him could not rest easy. For the deeper a story tries to vanish, the more stubbornly the universe insists on remembering. It began subtly. A lone shepherd claimed to have seen an empty throne carved from a single block of translucent stone, standing alone in the desert. When others went to find it, they saw nothing but windswept dunes. A fisherman, far to the east, told of pulling from the river a crown made of woven reeds, too fragile to have survived more than a day, yet when he touched it, he wept without knowing why. In a northern village, a young girl drew in the dust each morning a spiral that no one had taught her, whispering, "He is almost home." None of these stories were connected, not in geography or in language, and yet their rhythm was eerily familiar, as if the same consciousness were dreaming through different minds. Then came the scholars. They noticed strange gaps appearing in the historical record. Whole dynasties missing from official archives, manuscripts whose ink had turned transparent, monuments whose inscriptions had begun to fade, not with erosion, but as if the stone itself had decided to forget. The pattern was too precise to be natural. A historian named Lyron became obsessed with these anomalies. He traveled from crumbling libraries to abandoned monasteries, chasing the silence that threaded through all of them. In a temple buried under volcanic ash, he found a mural so faint that it could only be seen in moonlight. It showed a procession of figures dissolving into mist, and above them, a single inscription in a language older than writing: "When the world learns to forget, the king will return." Lyron devoted his life to deciphering that phrase. He began to see the erasure not as destruction, but as a kind of balance, a restoration of something lost to excess remembrance. "We built civilizations on memory," he wrote in his final journal. But memory without mercy becomes a prison. Perhaps he sought to free us from it. His colleagues dismissed him as a mystic, but Lyron's ideas spread quietly through the academic world, awakening a strange reverence for the notion of divine disappearance. Artists began creating works meant to vanish, paintings that dissolved in sunlight, songs performed only once and never recorded. A quiet rebellion against permanence began to take hold. In time, the phenomenon intensified. Languages began losing words overnight, not through disuse, but as if the collective mind of humanity had decided to lighten its load. People awoke unable to recall certain names, yet they felt relief instead of panic. Entire libraries began to empty themselves of meaning, the ink evaporating from the pages. Scientists were baffled. Some called it a neurological contagion, others a cosmic entropy event. But a small group of mystics saw it differently. They believed the king had never truly died, only dissolved into the fabric of time, and now the world itself was following him into stillness. Among these mystics was a woman named Nera. She lived in a remote observatory built atop a cliff where the ocean struck the rocks below like a heartbeat. Nera had spent her life studying the stars, convinced that they were mirrors reflecting the consciousness of the earth. When the first constellations began to dim, not vanish, but soften, as if stepping back into shadow, she understood. "He is erasing the heavens now," she said to her apprentices. "He began with himself, then with his name, then with the memory of his name. Now he erases the witnesses." The apprentices begged her to flee, to preserve her findings, but Nera only smiled. "You cannot run from peace," she said. On the final night of her life, Nera recorded her last observations. She spoke not of data, but of feeling. "The stars no longer burn, they hum," she said. "They do not shine, they breathe. We always thought light was life, but perhaps light was only noise. When the noise fades, something greater remains." At dawn, the observatory was found empty. Her telescope pointed not at the sky, but at the horizon where sea met air, a line so thin it seemed to erase itself the moment you looked too closely. Word of these disappearances spread across the globe, yet no one could fully recall the details. The world had entered an age of graceful forgetting. Wars ended not with treaties but with the quiet surrender of purpose. Cities dimmed their lights, people spoke softer. Art turned minimalist, almost sacred in its simplicity. Humanity began to crave stillness more than progress. In every culture, a new ritual arose. At dusk, people would gather by rivers and release small paper lanterns into the current. The lanterns bore no symbols, no prayers, only blankness. It was said the river knew what to remember. Historians later called this era the Great Softening. It was not marked by catastrophe, but by a collective exhale. The pace of existence slowed. Entire generations were born with fewer desires, less need to immortalize. They lived in the present like monks of the eternal now. And though no one spoke of the nameless king directly, his name long since erased, the shape of his silence was everywhere. In the calmness of dawn, in the hush of rain, in the pause between heartbeats where thought gives way to peace. Yet even silence has memory. Deep beneath the oceans, sensors still recorded faint vibrations that could not be traced to any source. The pattern of these waves formed a recurring shape, an endless spiral, the same one the girl in the northern village had once drawn in dust. Scientists tried to decode it, thinking it some form of communication, but all they found was rhythm, harmony, and absence. A musician later translated the vibration into sound. It became a single tone, low, resonant, hauntingly human. When played in concert halls, people wept without knowing why. Some said they felt something stir inside them, a longing not for what was lost, but for what was finally free. And so, the world learned to love its own fading. The act of disappearance became the highest art, the final generosity of the self. The legend of the nameless king had come full circle, not as history, not as religion, but as nature itself. The one who had erased his existence had taught creation how to breathe without the burden of eternity. He was no longer a myth. He was the quiet law beneath all things, that what truly belongs to the universe must one day dissolve into it. Still, on some nights, when the wind moves across open fields or the sea murmurs against the shore, those who listen closely claim to hear a voice, soft, patient, eternal, whispering from nowhere and everywhere at once. It does not speak words. It does not ask to be known. It only reminds the listener that to vanish completely is not to die, but to become the space through which life continues to flow. It began as a whisper among the quiet thinkers of a fading world. What if erasure was not loss at all, but the universe restoring its own balance? The nameless king, once thought a man, had long become an idea, and now even that idea was dissolving into something vaster. Across the lands, people started to dream of him not as a figure, but as a presence, a lightless calm at the edge of perception, a silence that felt alive. Those who experienced it described the sensation not as awe, but as peace so deep it blurred the boundary between self and eternity. "He is not gone," said one dying philosopher. "He is what remains when nothing else does." And perhaps, unknowingly, humanity had come to understand him at last. The few remaining records of history were by now fragments, unanchored memories floating in the void of partial recall. Monuments stood without inscriptions. Libraries existed without books. Yet people no longer mourned what was lost. They lived in the moment, unburdened by the noise of remembrance. Villages no longer marked years, only seasons. Children learned songs that had no words, only tones that mimicked the breathing of wind and water. It was as if the entire species had returned to the beginning, to a state before identity, before ambition, before the need to leave traces. In that simplicity, they found a serenity that no empire or religion had ever achieved. But the rivers still remembered. Beneath their glassy surfaces, currents carried vibrations, ancient rhythms that echoed the heartbeat of a vanished age. Travelers would sometimes pause at their banks and feel the faint hum beneath their feet, like a distant pulse reverberating through the earth. They didn't know it, but the same hum had been recorded in the earliest temples, the same frequency once carved into stone. The river had never stopped whispering. It had simply waited for ears quiet enough to hear. And now, as the world entered its final age of stillness, the whisper grew slightly louder, like the breath of something vast awakening beneath the surface. In the mountain valleys, shepherds began to notice patterns in the movement of mist, spirals that rose, formed, and vanished, always leaving the air a little colder than before. The elders called them the king's exhalations. To them, these spirals were not omens but blessings, signs that the world was finally exhaling alongside its forgotten ruler. Every morning, as the first light brushed the mountains, they would sit in silence and watch the mist dance, not daring to speak for fear of disturbing it. That silence became ritual, the last shared language of humankind. In one of the few remaining cities, a child named Sira was born. She had eyes like silver water and never spoke. When she was old enough to write, she filled the walls of her home with spirals, perfect, unbroken, infinite. People from distant lands came to see them, sensing something sacred in her wordless devotion. She would stand before the spirals for hours, tracing them with her fingertips as though remembering a shape she had never been taught. When asked why she drew them, she simply pressed her hand to her chest as if to say, "It's already here." Sira grew up in a world where language was nearly gone. Conversations were gestures, music was vibration, and history was feeling. Yet, one night she began to dream of a voice, not in words, but in meaning. It told her of a place beyond the river where the air shimmered with memory, where one could step into the quiet heart of all things. When she awoke, she knew what she had to do. Without speaking, she left her home and walked toward the great river that divided the known lands from the whispering plains. No one stopped her. They understood that she was not leaving, she was returning. 4 days she walked beside the river, following its slow, luminous current. The further she went, the quieter the world became. Even the sound of her footsteps began to fade, as though the earth itself were erasing her presence. At night, she slept under the stars, which by now had dimmed into pale embers scattered across a silver sky. On the 7th night, she reached the source, the spring where the river was born. The water emerged from a smooth stone, perfectly circular, with no cracks, no marks of time. In its reflection, Sira did not see her own face. She saw a vast, soft light expanding outward until it filled everything. She understood then, the nameless king had not vanished into oblivion. He had become the current itself, the eternal return of forgetting and remembering. She stepped into the spring. The water rose to meet her like a living thing, luminous and weightless. As it touched her skin, she felt memories dissolve, not just her own, but those of the entire world. Faces, stories, names, all slipping away like smoke through open fingers. Yet, with each loss came something greater, a profound clarity, a unity beyond thought. For a fleeting instant, she could see everything, the birth and death of stars, the flow of rivers through ages, the countless lives that had come and gone, and she realized that all of it was the same breath, endlessly cycling through form and emptiness. When dawn came, the villagers found the spring still and glowing faintly. Sira was gone. In her place, carved into the smooth stone, was a single spiral, etched not by hand, but by time itself. It pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. Those who saw it felt a calm so deep that they wept without reason. They understood that the cycle was complete. The one who had erased himself had not vanished alone. He had led the world to peace through forgetting. Generations passed, but no one counted them. The rivers ran clear. The stars dimmed until the sky was a gentle dusk. The world had become a poem of silence, written in water and air. And in that silence, existence found rest, not as an end, but as equilibrium. No kings, no names, no memory. Only being. Only the infinite breath of what once was and always would be. And if, somewhere in that stillness, a listener were to close their eyes and listen long enough, they might hear it still, the faint pulse of a forgotten king, the rhythm of the river, the voice of erasure singing softly beneath creation. Not a lament, not a goodbye, but the most sacred truth the universe had ever spoken. Nothing was ever lost, it merely learned to let go. The world no longer remembered the name of the king, or even the concept of kingship itself. Time had become circular, soft as dusk, and the boundaries between life and dream had thinned to mist. Oceans no longer raged, they murmured. Mountains eroded into gentle curves that caught the wind like the folds of sleeping giants. Humanity existed, but differently, less as conquerors of nature and more as guests of its silence. Villages were woven into forests, homes built from living trees that hummed with the rhythm of the wind. Children were born without the hunger for ownership. Their eyes reflected curiosity rather than ambition. They were taught not to ask who they were, but to listen to what the world was saying. In this new age, remembrance was considered sacred, not as a tool of control, but as an act of balance. Memory was fleeting by design, like breath. People shared stories knowing they would dissolve with the sunrise, and that was enough. They sang lullabies to the rivers at night, believing that water carried dreams more faithfully than paper ever could. The rivers, in turn, responded with ripples that glowed faintly in moonlight, as if whispering gratitude. Across the plains, luminous mists rolled gently between valleys, carrying a sound like distant chanting. The few elders who still remembered fragments of the old world believed these sounds were echoes of the king's final breath, a resonance that kept the world in harmony. There were no temples, no priests, no books. Only a single tradition remained, the ceremony of forgetting. Once every season, communities gathered at twilight to sit in silence beside their chosen water. No words were spoken, no fires were lit. Each person brought one object, a symbol of something they wished to release, a carving, a note, a strand of hair, a memory inscribed in stone. As the last light of day touched the horizon, they cast their offerings into the current and watched them disappear. The ritual was not one of mourning but of renewal. The act of letting go was how they honored what had been. One evening, during such a ceremony, a child named Nalen asked his grandmother why the people always gave their memories to the river. The old woman smiled, her eyes pale with age. "Because the river remembers better than we do," she said softly. "And because the river forgets when it is time." Nalen thought about this for a long time. He stared into the rippling surface until he saw his own reflection dissolve into the stars above. In that moment, he felt something shift inside him. A quiet understanding that memory was not meant to be held, but shared with the silence that holds everything together. Generations passed. The human race became smaller, fewer in number, yet infinitely wiser. There was no hunger, no conflict. Without the weight of ego or the illusion of permanence, there was simply no reason for conquest. People lived gently, their lives measured not in achievements but in harmonies. How well their days blended with the music of rain, the rhythm of dawn. They had no word for end. Even death was not an ending but a continuation, a soft merging into the greater stillness. Those who passed were said to join the hush. And still, deep beneath the quiet surface of the world, the pulse of the old king remained. It was faint but unbroken, woven into the frequency of existence itself. Some nights, when the air was perfectly still, a sound would rise from the earth, a low, resonant hum that traveled for miles. It was not frightening, it was comforting, familiar. The people called it the Beneath Song, believing it to be the world's own heartbeat. No one sought its source. They understood instinctively that to seek was to disturb. Instead, they listened. And in that listening, they found meaning beyond words. One winter, an elder named Solon sat alone by the river that bordered the settlement. The water had slowed under thin sheets of ice, moving lazily beneath translucent skin. Solon had lived long enough to remember traces of the old stories, though even he could not recall their full shape. He remembered only the feeling that there had once been a man who had taught the world how to rest. He leaned forward, his breath clouding the frozen surface, and whispered, "Are you still there?" The river made no reply, but a faint vibration moved through the ice, a tremor so delicate it could have been his imagination. He closed his eyes and smiled. "I thought so," he said. That night, Solon dreamt of a vast horizon covered in mist. From within the mist, a figure emerged, not royal, not divine, but simple, clothed in light so soft it seemed woven from dawn. The figure's face was blurred, undefined, as though carved from the absence of memory. Yet Solon felt no fear. The figure reached out its hand, and though it never spoke, Solon understood. All things returned to quiet. When he awoke, his body was still, but his face bore a faint, peaceful smile. The others who found him at sunrise did not weep. They placed his body in the river and watched it drift until the current carried him away. The surface rippled once, then stilled. From that day forward, the ceremony of forgetting gained a new purpose. The people no longer offered just objects. They offered stories, spoken softly into the air before silence reclaimed them. Each story was brief, gentle, and unfinished, as though inviting the universe to write its own ending. Through this, they honored the rhythm of the old king's erasure, the endless balance between being and unbeing. And as these rituals continued through generations, the world itself seemed to breathe easier. The wind carried fewer words. The earth grew quieter. The stars dimmed a little more, content to rest. Eventually, the last of humankind vanished too, not in fire or decay, but in a sigh. There was no apocalypse, no tragedy. The final generation simply drifted into the hush, leaving behind no monuments, no ruins, no traces. The rivers flowed unburdened, the mountains exhaled, and the silence deepened into something vast and eternal. Yet, within that silence, something lived, the memory of what once was, diffused and gentle, like the warmth of a distant sun that never sets. And somewhere, beyond the boundaries of form and time, the nameless king stood, no longer a being, but the stillness that breathes beneath creation. He did not rule, he did not watch. He simply was. His erasure had completed its purpose, and the universe, now balanced, hummed with quiet gratitude. What had once been a man had become the pause between moments, the heartbeat between stars. In every ripple of water, in every whisper of wind, he lingered, not as a ghost, but as the peace that follows understanding. The story of the king who erased himself had no ending, because endings belong to those who cling to time. His tale dissolved like mist over a river, infinite in its fading. For those who listen closely enough, even now, in the thin silence between thought and sleep, his presence can still be felt, A soft exhale from the edge of eternity, reminding the soul that to let go is not to vanish, but to finally become whole. Centuries turned to silence, and silence turned to memory. The universe itself seemed to hum with an ancient rhythm, neither alive nor dead, but existing in a state of eternal balance. Stars pulsed like the slow heartbeat of something greater, something awake yet dreaming. Space, once chaotic, filled with fire and collision, had quieted into vast oceans of stillness where light drifted like thought. There was no sound, yet every flicker of starlight carried an echo of what had been, a whisper of worlds that had risen and fallen, of voices that once sang and then forgot themselves into peace. In the folds of that cosmic quiet, the remnants of humanity existed only as faint impressions, a resonance not of form but of meaning. Their dreams had long detached from their fragile bodies, dissolving into the cosmic current like ink into water. They had become stories in the truest sense, not written, not spoken, but felt. These stories moved through galaxies like warm currents, touching the edges of new suns, weaving through the forming dust of planets yet unborn. On one such world, still young and trembling with creation, the air shimmered faintly, as though remembering something it had never known. The first winds of that world carried patterns that resembled human breath. In the ripples of its newborn oceans, reflections twisted into shapes resembling faces that no longer existed. The planet itself seemed to recall what life once meant, not through imitation, but through instinct. It began to hum. The sound was low and soft, like the beginning of a lullaby. It wasn't speech, but something deeper, a memory of communication itself. In that resonance, the spirit of the erased king lingered, not as a ruler, but as the quiet intelligence that guided existence. He was now a presence within every pattern, the way snow gathers meaning in silence, the way time folds in sleep. Then, from the dust of that new world, forms began to rise, not human, not animal, but something between. Beings of light and shadow, fluid and formless, drifted through the air as though born from thought. They had no language, but they recognized one another instantly, bound by the same memory that had shaped their birth. When they touched, their contact made the air vibrate with a gentle hum, the same pulse that once moved through Atlantis's forgotten heart. Though they did not know it, these beings carried within them the residue of everything that had ever been human: love, fear, hope, grief, all dissolved and remade into something pure. They did not build or destroy, they simply existed. Their purpose was not to remember the past, but to continue the silence that had birthed them. And yet, in rare moments, they would gather above the glowing oceans and create patterns in the sky, vast ribbons of luminescence that rippled like auroras. These shapes were not art or ritual, they were instinct. The universe itself was expressing its own dream through them. And if one looked closely enough, the forms they made told a story, the same story of the king who had once erased himself to save the world. It was not deliberate. The cosmos had simply never forgotten. Elsewhere, in the void between galaxies, something stirred. A ripple, faint and distant, traveled across the cosmic fabric. It was neither creation nor destruction, but a fluctuation, a breath. Within that breath, a spark appeared, then another, until the dark once more filled with tiny suns. The cycle of existence began again, not out of will, but out of necessity. Every universe, it seemed, must eventually remember itself in order to forget again. The silence of one age becomes the echo that seeds the next. And so it was that the story of Atlantis, the world that rose from perfection, drowned in memory, and found peace in erasure, became not a myth, but a frequency. It existed everywhere and nowhere, encoded in the vibration of atoms, in the pulse of light, in the soundless gap between thunder and rain. Each new civilization that would one day form in the distant cosmos would unknowingly carry fragments of it in their dreams. They would build, destroy, weep, and wonder, never realizing that their yearning for balance, for truth, for meaning, was not their own. It was the echo of a choice made by a nameless king in an age long forgotten. Sometimes, in the stillness between creation and collapse, that echo would surface in strange ways. A poet on a distant world might dream of a shining city swallowed by the sea. A child might whisper to the wind and feel it answer. A civilization might reach the height of its power, only to be undone by its own reflection. And when they finally face their end, they too would understand what the king once did, that the greatest mercy in existence is not eternal life, but peaceful oblivion. As eons drifted by, the universe became a vast, sleeping being, a mind stretched across infinity, dreaming of itself. In the deepest layers of that dream, where even light could not reach, the essence of the king rested. He had become the silence between things, the pause between heartbeats, the gap between waves, the breath before dawn. He was not remembered, yet he was never lost. Every sigh of wind, every ripple of water, every flicker of starlight was his continuation. He was the memory that forgets, the dream that awakens only to fall asleep again. And in that infinite sleep, existence found its balance. There was no sorrow, no desire, no longing. Only stillness, a perfect, eternal exhale. The universe had finally become what it was always meant to be, a single, unbroken moment of peace. And in that peace, the king, no longer a being, no longer even a concept, whispered the final truth into the void, a truth so soft it could only be felt, never heard. To erase is to love beyond the self. The cosmos listened. And then, once again, it began to dream. 1,250 words. The stars burned softly in the quiet, their glow dimming as if bowing to the end of a story too vast to be told. Somewhere, in the eternal hum of the universe, the last echoes of the king's memory dissolved like mist at dawn. What remained was not loss, but completion, a sense that everything had unfolded exactly as it must. Time no longer rushed forward or folded back. It simply existed, breathing gently through the fabric of space. Across that boundless expanse, creation waited, not with urgency, but with patience, as though the next dream would rise only when the silence was ready. And within that silence, the king's final gift lingered unseen, the understanding that all things, no matter how grand, must one day let go of themselves to be free. The sea had stilled, the stars had sighed, and the universe had finally learned to rest. There, in that infinite calm, every story found its ending, and every ending became a beginning once more. The light faded, not into darkness, but into peace, a soft, endless sleep where even memory ceased to ache. The stars flickered softly, like fading memories returning for one last glance. The universe, vast and breathing in silence, carried the essence of everything that had ever been, the laughter, the sorrow, the choices that shaped eternity. Among those faint echoes, the king's final act still pulsed like a heartbeat woven into time itself. No monuments marked his name, no histories remembered his face, yet every whisper of wind, every ripple of starlight carried his peace. In the quiet expanse, his story lived on, not in remembrance, but in balance, where forgetting had finally become the purest form of love. The sea was calm again. Waves rolled gently beneath a pale sky, their motion slow and deliberate, as if time itself had learned to breathe. A single flame drifted across the water, carried by the wind, a remnant of countless fires that had burned before. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the last echo of thunder faded into silence. In that stillness, the story found its rest. The berserker's journey had not been about victory or conquest, but about the quiet persistence of spirit. His rage had shaped the ages, his memory had carried through stars, and his fire had taught the world to endure. Now only peace remained. If one stood by the shore and listened closely, they might hear it, the faint rhythm of a heartbeat beneath the tide, the same pulse that had once defied death. The waves whispered his name, not as a god, but as a promise. For every life born from struggle, for every spark that refused to fade, his essence lived on. And as the sun sank behind the endless sea, the world exhaled in perfect harmony. The fire remembered. The storm slept. The immortal heart finally found home.